So today we're going to be looking at very basic canoeing techniques that you'll be using in the fall Flubu canoe trip. We're going to be looking at steering techniques as well as a specific role for the bow person or the front of the boat and the stern person, which is the back of the boat. Feel free to rewatch these videos as you see fit. The purpose is not for you to master these techniques by watching, but just to give you a bit of basic information on what the strokes are and how they'll help steer your boat when it comes to the canoe trip in the fall. We're only going to be looking at flat water techniques today, no rapids or moving water techniques, but this is just a very basic introduction to get you started. So the first thing you need to know is the bow, which is the front of the boat. That person is really in charge of propelling the canoe, or in other words, they're the engine. So they'll be doing the same basic stroke throughout the paddling time. Every once in a while they can help do a corrective stroke, but mainly it is the person in the back or the stern that'll be steering the canoe. And so we'll be demonstrating on the water what your basic paddling stroke looks like, and then we'll get into the steering strokes afterwards. So when you're paddling out on the water, you really want your stroke to reach up nice and high. So notice how my grip hand, and then this is my power hand on the lower part of the shaft, nice and high, and it's going to penetrate the water right in front of you and come down across. Just Isabel's going to do the same thing. A lot of students tend to reach forward and it's all arms, and you'll notice you'll get very tired doing that all day long. So once again, you want to reach out nice and high, have the arm come across the body and penetrate the water. At this point, you'll have to start the recovery stroke. So as my paddle gets behind me, I take it out of the water, I turn the blade, and I slice it back through the air. Especially when the wind's across from you or in front of you, this will get you extra tired. So slice it through the air, and then you'll start your next stroke. So when you're out on the water, it's really important that you have great communication between the person in the bow and the person in the stern, as well as have an effective stroke, because you'll be taking a paddle stroke a couple of thousand times in a single day. So proper technique will help prevent preemptive fatigue during your paddle day. A lot of times beginner paddlers will tend to put the paddle in right here, and they're pulling with their arms, especially that lower arm, and you'll see that'll get you tired quite quickly. So what we really want to see is reaching out that grip hand nice and high, and the lower hand stays right here, and it comes down across the body. So I'm using this hand to pull, but I'm also using this hand with gravity to push that paddle along. What I can also do at this point, at this height, is use my core and my back, which are much bigger muscle groups, to help add power to the stroke, and that'll help prevent fatigue throughout the day. The other thing that my responsibility is in the stern is to try and paddle at the same time as Isabel. If we paddle at different times, our canoe is going to zigzag and it'll wobble as well, so it'll be a lot less effective. So if we were to start to paddle using proper technique, I'll time it at the same time as Isabel, and you'll see the canoe will go in a much straighter line, and there's a lot less wobble, and it'll be much more efficient at preserving momentum. Momentum is key in canoeing, so whenever you can keep it and carry it, you're going to have an easier day. So one of the first steering strokes we're going to do is the C stroke or the sweep. It's only for the person in the stern typically. However, more advanced paddlers can also have the person in the bow use it to help with steering. For your sweep stroke, if you're in the stern, you want to start by choking up on the paddle shaft, and you're going to have your paddle come out at about 90 degrees, so perpendicular to your body, and you're going to sweep it or kind of draw a C pattern and bring the water around the back of the boat. What this does is it'll actually steer the canoe away from the side the person in the stern is paddling on. So we'll paddle. It always works with a bit of momentum, so Isabel's going to paddle with me, and I'll do a couple of C strokes and you'll see the effect. So engaging my first C stroke now, and I turn away from the side I'm paddling on. I carry that water all the way behind the boat, and it's turning me to the left because I'm paddling on the right. So while you're doing the C stroke, it's really important that the person in the bow keeps paddling. This stroke requires momentum. And while I'm doing this stroke, I'm not generating a lot of force. So Isabel's really the one who's allowing me to have an effective sweep right now. If she stops paddling, then I'm not really going to be moving very much at all. The next stroke we're going to see is the J stroke, and it has the opposite effect of the sweep or the C stroke. What this stroke is going to do is it's going to turn the canoe towards the side that the person in the stern is paddling on. So once again, this is a stroke for the person in the stern. More often than not, this is the stroke you're going to use because the canoe will have a tendency to steer away from the side the person in the stern is paddling on. It's a little bit trickier because it uses your upper hand a lot more, but with a paddle rotation. So the stroke starts as a regular paddle stroke, but once the paddle reaches behind me, if you notice my thumb, it rotates down so that the paddle ends up being perpendicular with the water. At this point, I'm going to use this lower hand and I'm going to push the water a little bit away from me. And that's going to turn the canoe towards the side I'm paddling on. So in this case, we're going to turn to the right. The more you flare out that paddle, the sharper your turn is going to be, but the more speed you're going to lose. So it's much more beneficial for your momentum, which once again is what's going to cost the most energy. We want to preserve that momentum. It's much more efficient to do several small J strokes in a row than to do one very large J stroke where we'll turn sharp but lose all of our speed that Isabel and I will have to build up again. And so once we start doing it, once again, the person in the bow has to keep paddling for the stroke to work. We can start, Isabel. And I'm just going to do a couple of small J strokes and you'll see the canoe starts to turn to the right. I can do larger ones and we start to turn sharper. On this side, paddle goes in, I rotate the hand down, flares out, and now I'll turn to the left. If you're having a hard time rotating your shoulder to do the J-stroke effectively, because you notice my wrist is rotating and my entire shoulder blade is, or my shoulder cuff is rotating as well, to have that rotation in the paddle, we can always do a modified version. The modified version is next to the same. It's almost the same. It's a bit more easy to execute, but you might notice your hand gets sore after a while. But basically, after the stroke, notice my thumb, instead of rotating it downwards, which is the traditional J-stroke, I just bring the paddle back and I bring my thumb upwards. My blade still ends up parallel to the boat, and then I can push out. Once again, if you're doing a lot of J-strokes, you might find the tissue between your index and your thumb gets sore after a while. Some people will call this the goon stroke. I've heard it called a lot of different things, but essentially it'll have the same effect. If Isabel starts to paddle, I can paddle and I just push out here at the end, and it'll turn me towards the side I'm paddling on, just like a traditional J-stroke would. The next stroke we're going to see is the draw, and that can be used to pivot the boat without actually having that forward momentum. So it's quite straightforward, but it does take a bit of practice. What you're going to want to do is reach out from the boat, draw the water towards the hull, and then once your paddle is next to the boat, rotate your upper hand, slice back out, and repeat the stroke. So if Isabel and I both do a draw, you'll notice the boat's not actually moving forwards or backwards, but we're pivoting right on the spot. So normally you wouldn't pivot in the middle of a lake, but if you have to do a sharp corner or if you just need to turn around to talk to somebody, this can be a very effective stroke. The opposing stroke to the draw is called the pry. Once again, it's a stroke the person in the bow and the stern can do at the same time to help pivot. It'll just have the opposite effect. So we turned counterclockwise last time doing the draw. This time we'll turn clockwise by doing the pry. So you start by putting the paddle next to the hull, you pry the water away, and you cut back. What's really important to note here is that you'll see Isabel's not prying against the hull. If I were to demonstrate on this side, You don't want to pull this way, because what that does is it's actually going to push the gunnel of the canoe down towards the water, and it makes you quite tippy. So I've seen a lot of people tip that way. So remember, when you're doing your pry, it's straight in, but there should be no contact between the shaft of the paddle and the gunnel of the boat. So if we were to pry from this point, push out, cut back in, and you'll see the boat will pivot. And because I've switched sides, we're going to pivot counterclockwise once again. So now that we've seen the draw and the pry, we can use them together to also move the boat laterally instead of just pivoting in the middle of the water. And so if I do the opposite stroke of Isabel, if she's going to do a pry and I do a draw, she's moving the front of the boat away from her and I'm moving the back of the boat towards me, and we actually move without moving forwards or backwards. We're moving towards the camera in this instance. This can be really good when you're trying to park the boat next to a dock or next to a sharp rock. Instead of going nose first, you can line up sideways and use this technique. Now if we reverse roles and Isabel starts doing the draw and I do the pry, it'll have the opposite effect and we move away. Once again, communication here is key, because if I generate more force than Isabel, you'll notice my back end's going to swing out more. So I want to make sure that I'm prying as hard as she's drawing, and we'll move perfectly sideways across the water. If you'd like to replace the draw stroke with a different stroke, there's what we call the feather or the figure eight. Basically what it's going to look like is I'm going to have the paddle at about this distance away from me. I'm going to feather or draw a figure eight back and forth, so it's just a very minor movement while slightly pulling with my lower hand. The blade's never actually going to get closer to the hull of the boat. It's just always generating a minor pulling force, and if Isabel does it at the same time with an equal force, we'll move towards our target. So this is the first time you see Isabel and I actually paddling on the same side. It doesn't often occur in canoeing. You typically have people paddling on opposite sides, but in this case, because we're trying to move laterally with the feather stroke, we would have to be doing it on the same side. If we feathered on opposite sides, we would be doing a pivot like you saw in the earlier videos. So just a nice arc, a crescent, and I'm slightly pulling with this lower hand, and you can go slower, you can go faster, but as long as you have that pulling motion, it'll bring you towards your target or the side you're paddling on. Now we're going to demonstrate how to properly launch and land the canoe when you're leaving shore or arriving on a campsite. This is really important. It's probably the time where I've seen people tip their canoes the most often. Now normally it's not that big of a deal if you tip here because the water's shallow, but your things will still get wet. So it's nice to do it properly so that nobody gets hurt and your things can stay dry for the rest of the trip. So there's a couple of steps to it depending on whether you're in the bow or you're in the stern. So if I were to be in the stern and we'd be ready to leave on our trip, what I would want to do is sit on the deck of the boat and I'm going to straddle it and use my thighs, and I'm going to squeeze the hull of the boat with my inner thighs to try and keep it in place. Now I could use my paddle on the gunnels as well to add stability, or if I prefer I can have my paddle down and keep my hands for stability. Either way, I want to really be squeezing here, be firmly planted, and hold the boat nice and steady for Isabel to walk in. Now Isabel's going to put her paddle down and she's going to make sure to always step in the middle of the boat. It's the most stable place, and the lower she can stay, the lower her center of gravity and the less tippy the boat's going to be. So during this time, I'm just concentrating on keeping the boat steady, and I'm going to kind of try and counteract any wobbling of the boat by adjusting myself accordingly. Once she's in her seat and she has her paddle and she's told me she's ready to go, I can then enter the boat. There's a couple of ways you can do this if you like. Typically when you're launching as well, if you have a lot of gear in your boat, you want the boat at least halfway in the water or 2/3 into the water. Otherwise you won't be able to push it in and it's really damaging to the hull of the boat. In this case, we have a lot of water, so that's not a problem. So at this stage here, I could either choose, because there's enough water, I could step into the boat completely, or I can do a bit of a skateboard technique. So the first method, I would step in the boat in the middle. Once again, Isabel's got her hands on the gunnels. She's trying to keep the canoe steady. If it was really unstable, she could even kneel down and push her knees to the outside of the hull, and that'll add extra stability as well. All right. So I could then step into the boat in the middle here as well, and we could start paddling. The other way we could do it, sorry Isabel, I'll just demonstrate the second way. All right. If I back the boat up a little bit, typically, if we had less water, or if we were still on shore a little bit, you can do a similar technique, similar to a skateboard. So I'll put one foot in, both hands on the gunnels, and I'll kick with my other leg to get us offshore, and then I could kneel or sit on the seat, and we could start paddling away. So now that we've finished our day of paddling, it's time to get to the campsite and to land the boat. So first thing we're going to do is get closer to shore. You'll really want to slow down as you get closer. If we have enough speed, you can also brake. And to brake, it's very simple. You just put your paddle in the water and you kind of push forward a bit. And we'll lose all of our speed that way. So it's quite easy because of the friction of the water. Braking happens fairly naturally. This is a nice proper speed to get towards shore and to not cause damage to the front of the boat. We don't want to ram them into the shore. A lot of campsites have a lot of rocks, just like here as well. So we want to protect the boats. Once I've gotten to the front and we've nicely made a landing, I'm going to stabilize as Isabel gets out. So once again, I'm pushing against the sides, holding the gunnels. She's going to step out of the boat, and it's essentially the reverse of the launch. Now she's going to straddle the boat, stabilize it with her inner thighs so that I can then get out. Depending on the landing, here we have a nice sand beach. I could step out here into about a foot and a half of water. However, certain campsites might have an actual drop off, so I wouldn't be able to touch, or there might be a lot of mud or bloodsuckers or other things that I don't want to really get into. So I could also put my paddle down, and with her stabilizing it, I could stay low, stepping in the middle of the boat, and get to a nice shallower area or drier area, and then exit the boat. At this point, Isabel and I can both carry the boat out of the water, and we're at the campsite for the day. You're reaching up nice and high. So when the paddle goes through, you end up like looking over this arm. All right, and then on the recovery, once you've paddled, I want you to bring it back and twist the blade so it's nice and flat, and then just bring it back, just like that. That's it, that's all.
Okay, so I'm shooting this.
Okay, so. All right, grab your paddle. You good?